and welcome. We will be in Acts chapter 27 tonight. And last week in chapter 26, Paul was there in Caesarea giving King Agrippa his explanation. And if we remember from the previous chapters that Festus, the governor there in Caesarea, he didn't know what to do with Paul during his second court hearing. So Paul, in response, he appealed to Caesar. But before sending him, Festus needed something to write to explain to Caesar what Paul was being charged with, because he still couldn't come up with anything. He knew what the Jewish priests were bringing against Paul, but it really had nothing to do with Roman law. It had everything to do with what was in the Jewish religious law. And so, for Festus, he didn't know he couldn't say that, because that would have just basically said, Festus, don't you know how to govern? This is ridiculous. Why would you send Paul up based on what we have so far here? And so he was kind of at a loss. So King Agrippa arrives, and Festus asks him to question Paul. Maybe you can find something for me. Could you do my homework too? And then while you're at it, could you get it all typed up, so I wouldn't have to deal with it at all? And so this was what had taken place in chapter 25. Hey, King Agrippa, can you interrogate him? Can you interview him? Could you get some more information out of him? So in verse 1 of chapter 26, King Agrippa tells Paul, okay, now you can speak for yourself. And at this time, the Jewish priests weren't making charges against Paul. So it was basically Paul's time to just, explain what he had already explained several times before. And he gladly did it. And we noted last week that Paul always seemed to steer the conversation away from himself. So King Agrippa says, hey, Paul, you can speak for yourself now. And Paul says, hey, great. All right, now I'm going to start speaking, and we're just going to direct this conversation away from myself. And then Paul gives an explanation as to why he's standing before the king, but he doesn't leave it there. And he says that it's because of the hope of the promise of the prophets, and the fulfillment of that hope in Jesus is why he is doing what he is doing. And so it's rooted in the Old Testament. It's rooted in what the prophets had said. It's not something that he just came up with out of the blue. It's something that is rooted into the Word. And he doesn't shy away from bringing up his past, no matter how difficult it can be to bring attention to his failings. Because we notice over and over again in his explanations, he always seems to bring up the fact that I was this, I did this. These are the things I did to Christians. And we can sometimes gloss over that and think, oh yeah, Paul's just, reiterating what he said many times before. But at the same time, we think of our past failings, and if we were to bring those up constantly to people to try to convince them not of ourselves and how bad we have it, but convince them of the greatness of God and the greatness of Jesus, he doesn't let self-pity and bitterness creep into his message. He uses it as a tool to say, yeah, this is how bad I was, and still God saved me, and God can save you too. So what was Paul really doing? And he wasn't trying to free himself. In verse 27, he directs a very important question to King Agrippa. Do you believe? And quite a question, and it requires a yes or a no. It's a yes or no question, and unfortunately, King Agrippa left it without an answer. And I can imagine King Agrippa intently listening to Paul throughout all this whole explanation that's taking place. He's probably looking Paul in the eye, just soaking it all in, taking it in, because he knows what the prophet said. He's very familiar with all this information. And so Paul's explaining to it, and maybe it's making sense in his mind, and he's listening to Paul, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, here comes this question, and maybe you're not ready for it. Maybe you don't want to answer it right away, but it's something that it is a yes or no question. And maybe King Agrippa's thinking, boy, this Paul guy is really convincing. And then after Paul finishes, King Agrippa confers with Festus and Bernice about it, almost avoiding the issue entirely. Well, maybe Paul would have been freed if he had not appealed. And it's weird because you look at that statement and it almost looks absurd based on everything that Paul said. During that whole chapter, everything that Paul said And this is what they had to discuss afterwards. Well, if he hadn't appealed, he would have been free. Well, how about some lunch, That's kind of a tough message. I don't really want to think about that right now. I don't want to think what I would have to do or what it would require me to do. So how about we just, make this a little bit more lighthearted and move on from here, and we can just leave it where it's at. I don't need to answer that yes or no question as if I believe or not. So let's open our Bibles to Acts chapter 27. All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you so much that we have your word here that we can study, that you've given us this gift, and oftentimes, I know for myself, I take it for granted that I have this book that I can open up at any time. And it's not just pages with written words on there, it's your word of life to us. And I pray that we treat it like that, and I pray that it speaks to us tonight and understand that you're behind all of this, Lord. That this book wasn't written just because a group of people got together and decided it'd be really great to write it. Lord, you were using people to pen your words to us so we could understand you, so we could have a knowledge of you, so we could have a relationship with you. You desire that of us. I pray that we desire the same of you, Lord. Help our eyes to be open as we read tonight. In your name we pray. Amen. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which is about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. And the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and received care. And from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia, and there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. And when we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a certain place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. And when considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them, and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be attended with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And when a moderate south wind came up, supposing they had gained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before long there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Eurykeel, and when the ship was caught in it, it could not face the wind. We gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. And running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis. They let down the sea anchor, and so let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in the midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice, and not to have set sail from Crete, and incurred this damage and loss. And yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there shall be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God, and it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island." But when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. And they took sounding and found it to be 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took another sounding, found it to be 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. As the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. And until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you shall perish." And having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. And he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. And all of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. And when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a certain bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. And hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where 2 seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, that none of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion wanted to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And thus it happened that they were brought safely to land. All right. So we leave the dramatic court scenes of the previous chapters. Those are for some people, and all the passionate speeches. And now we come to a different kind of drama. It's an adventure. Remember, Paul appealed to Caesar. And so now it is decided to send Paul to Italy. So Paul was sent with other prisoners with a centurion named Julius. It seems like Paul's always getting in contact with these centurions, and oftentimes it seems like to his benefit. These centurions almost seem to be more honorable people than the governors that are ruling over the cities in the places where Paul's at. And so it's really neat to see how God places people in Paul's life, and at the same time I think we can recognize that for our own lives, that any time that we face trouble of a certain kind, that there are certain times that God places people in our lives and we think, man, that just didn't happen by chance, that there's a reason you're here. So Paul boards the ship, and they sail up the coast to Sidon, and Julius allows some freedom to visit with the Christians there. And after they proceeded north and west around Cyprus, here we are given the first indication of some weather issues. The winds were working against them. And so here's what has taken place. They're going to Italy. And so that's where they're heading towards Rome, because that's when Paul appealed to Caesar. This is the whole reason that this is taking place. Now all the speeches, all the explanations done, and now it's time to leave. And so they get on board the ship, and it's getting close to winter time, and the seas on the Mediterranean are not something to contend with during that time because of how fierce they can be. And so they're getting close to winter, so hasn't set in yet. And so they start up the coast, they go to Sidon, and then they start going around. If we had a map, we'd be able to show you, but you can look at it and you can see, okay, they're going north along the coast there, and then they go north and then west. Between Cyprus and between the mainland, which is now present-day Turkey. And they're going along that area. And as it says there in chapter 27, it said, now we get some first indication of some weather issues of the winds that are working against them. They're contrary. Let's see. It says in verse 7, with difficulty they erupt since the wind did not permit us to go further. Or even before that is verse 5, when they sailed through along the coast of Sicily and landed at Myra. Yeah, on verse 4 actually. From there we put out sea, sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. So now they have to take some alternative plans with the ship to get where they needed to go. And so they landed at Myra, and from there they found another ship bound for Italy, and they boarded it, and it was struggling also because of the wind. And so this continues to plague them on their trip. So they went southwest towards the island of Crete and continued to struggle along. And you can just think, I mean, sometimes you have these traveling adventures that you go on, and I don't know, sometimes we get those bad feelings about it. It just doesn't look right. Maybe we should just stay where we're at. Maybe we should just let things pass and be done with it. And so here's, Paul, he gets on board the ship, and sometimes, and I don't know if you ever have that thought that crosses your mind, that maybe when you're flying on the airlines and you cross that gate, you're walking down the bridge and you get on the plane and you just have this weird thought, am I going to be returning in the same manner? I mean, that's the plan. Nobody wants to die. But at the same time, that thought does cross your mind. You think, okay, I hope and I pray that in a few short hours, I will walk back in the opposite direction at a very similar place, probably not the same place you left from, similar place, but it has similar things there, like a jetway that you walk out of and say, okay. But for Paul, it didn't turn out that way. And so here they are, they're struggling along. They're heading towards the island of Crete. And they came to a place called Fair Havens, and they stayed there a while. And while they were there, the weather turned from bad to worse. And then Paul speaks up at this moment, and he says, hey guys, this doesn't look good. I think we will lose everything, including our lives, if we continue on like this. Now, it wasn't as if Paul just worked in an office somewhere in Jerusalem and he, followed weather information and he became a little weather expert just by looking at things on the computer. This is not something where Paul was unfamiliar with this. Paul, as we've read many times in Acts, is that he was quite the traveler. He went all over. He's probably not an expert on sailing in the Mediterranean, but he's definitely familiar with it. He's spent plenty of time on the sea to be able to recognize things that are probably pretty decent weather and things that aren't decent weather. So there's a decision-making process here. And as a pilot myself, oftentimes I find myself, reading up on accident reports and things like that, and it can be kind of morbid. But at the same time, as a pilot, you actually learn something because you're reading through it. The most eerie part is when you get to the very last part of it and you see the last words, and then there's nothing else after that, and you know what that means. That's when the crash took place. But everything before that, you're looking at all the links in the chain to see what was it that took place. And there are some instances, and it's strange because you look at things that happened back then and it's stuff that happens today. It's people not listening to other people. And it's happened to where probably about 30 years ago they had a situation where this captain of this airliner was intent on doing this one thing despite what the other two people in the cockpit were letting him know. They were bringing it up, hey, we're low on fuel. We can't, if we continue this way, we're going to run out. And the captain didn't pay attention to it. He was obsessed with another issue that was going on. And then they ended up crashing. They ended up running out of fuel. They had plenty of fuel to make it to the airport, even though they might have had an emergency situation there, but at least you're at an airport with all the emergency services. What ended up happening is they ended up crashing in a wooded forest. And out of that crash came all of these questions. Why did the captain not listen to the other two people that were bringing up the information? And so you can kind of look here and see, boy, stuff that happens today, in a very similar sense, happened back then. Paul is speaking up. He's voicing his concern. He's not just idly standing by going, wow, boy, that really kind of getting rough out there. Well, all right, everybody aboard the ship, let's go. And now he's being very cautious about it. He looks at the weather and he's like, this is not good. I don't think, it hasn't gotten better. As a matter of fact, it's gotten worse. He's noticed the trend. He brings it up. The centurion there, I got to give him, some sort of credit because he doesn't know Paul very well. And certainly your instinct is to trust the captain, the pilot of the ship. And so your instinct is to go, hey, what do you say? You're the expert. You're the one that's on these seas all the time. What do you think? And they said, no, it's not good to stay here. Let's continue on a little further, and I think we can find a better place to put this ship in. So the centurion, he ignores Paul's protests, and so the centurion listens to the pilot instead. And so they make their way out. So they begin sailing along the southern shore of the island of Crete. And while they were sailing, they were caught in a fierce storm. So now it was getting bad with all the winds that were taking place. And now, something that happens, and I'm sure we can probably see this in weather events, that weather just, sometimes it gradually changes, and sometimes it changes very rapidly. And sometimes when you talk to people, and maybe they're caught in some sort of situation like that, they'll get the interview, the TV interview, and oftentimes their explanation is, wow, that just came out of nowhere. That has been said probably thousands, if not millions of times when it came to weather events. And I'm sure they were saying the same thing here. However, you did have some of these indications with the winds not cooperating, and now it turned into something else. A violent wind, the Bible calls it. It was basically a fierce storm that they were caught in. The ship was being driven by the wind out of control. The sailors were no longer in charge of the direction of the ship. The wind was in charge now. And they feared that the ship would break apart because of the rough water and the seas. And so what they did is they strung along ropes. And this was a cargo ship. They were carrying a wheat to Italy. And so what they did is they took these large ropes and they girded it around the ship so it wouldn't break. It was kind of an extra support for the ship because that's how violent the seas were. Is that when you have this concern, you're in such a large cargo ship and all the weight that goes along with it, but at the same time, you're actually concerned that it's going to break apart. They are now into emergency mode. This is not just, okay, we kind of have some problems, everybody buckle your seatbelts, and we'll be through this in probably about 5 to 10 minutes. This is something to where, okay, all hands are on deck, now we need to address the situation. I can just imagine, here's Luke writing all this stuff down. He's along for the ride. He's there with Paul and everybody else that's taking place. I mean, it's so funny because you see this, how he's writing it, and it just seems so, maybe more of a technical sense. Well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and you think, man, to actually put yourself on that ship, to see what's taking place. They enter this storm, and then the next day, and the day after, they start throwing cargo overboard. So they go into emergency mode to take the ropes, gird up the ship, and now they're actually throwing stuff overboard. If somebody who wasn't familiar with riding on a ship in the Mediterranean, that would probably get your attention. I think you maybe just right there, trying to manage your tea that you're drinking or something like that because of the top. And then you start to see the sailors take stuff and throw overboard and you think, okay, this is just not your normal passage in the Mediterranean. This is something a little bit more serious. No sun, no stars, no control, no way to navigate, and no hope. And those on board slowly gave up. And then Paul stands up, and he says this, you should have listened to me.